Good afternoon. I'm Hale Esfandiari. Like to welcome you to today's meeting on Iran's nuclear chess, calculating America's move. As we all know, Iran and the P5+1 have been negotiating since last November with the aim of reaching a permanent agreement regarding Iran's nuclear program. They hope to do so by July 20th. Yesterday, we all waited in trepidation. Instead, the two sides decided to extend the negotiations for another 4 months. This is both a good sign and not such a good sign. Obviously, the parties feel they have made sufficient progress to continue talking, but it is the case that major differences remain and the gap between the two sides remain wide. Most commentary by the press and observers has focused on differences over centrifuge numbers, but Mr. Araqchi, one of Iran's chief negotiators, has indicated differences remain over at Iraq and the pace at which sanctions will be lifted. He told a group of Iranian journalists that 80% of the discussion of the last 2 weeks were focused on Iraq. We organized today's meeting to launch a just published monograph by my colleague Robert Litwak, the Vice President for Scholars and Directors of International Security Studies at the Center, intriguingly entitled Nuclear Chess, Calculating America's Move. Naturally, we want to use this opportunity to examine where we stand with these vital negotiations. I'm going to give a brief introduction of the other speakers. You have their long bios. As you know, in addition to Rob, we are delighted to have with us two top experts in the field. David Sanger from the New York Times, who was in Vienna until a few days ago and is here back fresh from the negotiation, and Mitchell Reese, who is currently the president of Washington College and the former director of policy planning at the State Department, and as of October, he will be the CEO and president of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. So make sure you go and visit Williamsburg. This is a pitch for you, Mitch.
Thank you, Hala.
Both Mitch and David were former public policy scholars at the center. Rob will go first to share with us the basis, thesis, and argument of his study and to give us his take on the development in Vienna. He will be followed by Mitch and by David. A brief discussion among the panelists will precede the question and answer period. I also would like to welcome today Ambassador Joseph Gildenhorn, who is the former chairman of the board of trustees of the Wilson Center, a supporter of the Middle East program, always supporting us, no matter whether he agrees or disagrees with the discussions. And he's currently, with Mrs. Gildenhorn, the co-chair of the Wilson National Cabinet. I would urge you, if possible, to close your cell phones, because I'm told it always interferes with the live webcast. And when we go to the question and answers, please don't give us comments, just give us your brief questions. Rob?
Thank you, Hale, and for that introduction and for all that you've done to make today possible. And thanks to my old friends Mitchell Reese and David Sanger for participating in today's event. The negotiations over Iran's nuclear program validate Einstein's observation that politics is more difficult than physics. In theory, an agreement to resolve the Iranian nuclear challenge should be a straightforward trade-off between technology and transparency. Iran would retain a limited nuclear program under international safeguards in return for the lifting of economic sanctions. Technical details, such as numbers of permissible centrifuges, the scope of international inspections, and a timetable of sanctions relief based on Iranian compliance could be readily worked out. The hard reality, of course, is that the nuclear impasse has so far proved intractable because of its quintessentially political character. For both Iran and the United States, the nuclear issue is a proxy for a more fundamental debate. In Iran, the nuclear issue is a surrogate for the defining debate over the country's future relationship with the outside world, whether, in former President Rafsanjani's words, the Islamic Republic is a revolutionary state or an ordinary country. In America, Iran's nuclear challenge has also been a proxy for a more fundamental debate about the threat posed by rogue states in the post-9/11 era. The Obama administration dropped the Bush-era moniker of rogue state in an interview with David Sanger, and instead called Iran an outlier. The rogue rubric had connoted states whose ruling regimes were essentially irredeemable, that their threatening behavior was inextricably linked to the character of their regimes. This argument was central to the Bush administration's case for preventive war in Iraq. By contrast, the outlier rubric was intended to suggest that a path was open for Iran to rejoin the community of nations if the Tehran regime complied with its obligations under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. Yet the tension between the competing objectives of regime change and behavior change continues to churn the U.S. policy debate. Since the onset of the current crisis in 2002, when the existence of the covert enrichment site at Natanz was revealed, 3 policy options have been advanced to address Iran's nuclear challenge: military strike, containment, and engagement. Each strategy is based on a different assessment of the Tehran regime and the prospects for societal change. But in contrast to George Kennan's classic X article, tellingly entitled "The Sources of Soviet Conduct," the sources of Iranian conduct are frequently not subjected to rigorous analysis. Key assumptions about the character of the Iranian regime, assumptions that undergird the 3 strategy options, are often unarticulated or reflect an ideological predilection or even a vain hope. A military strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure rests on the assumption that the theocratic regime is undeterrable and that the acquisition of a nuclear capability is therefore unacceptable. One variant of this strategy is that a military strike might actually trigger a popular uprising against the regime. The underlying assumption of the containment option is that either targeted sanctions on the regime's core interest groups or general sanctions on the populace will create amplified pressure on the regime's leadership to alter its conduct. Finally, the pure engagement option assumes that the basis of a nuclear agreement exists, but the United States has not offered big enough carrots to induce the clerical regime's acceptance of an agreement. Though the Iranian challenge is qualitatively different than the Soviet Union's threat of Kennan's era, the analytical challenge is analogous. Plausible but faulty assumptions can lead to policy miscalculations of major consequence. When India surprised the world in May 1998 with a nuclear test, the head of the U.S. government's review panel to investigate why the CIA had failed to predict it astutely observed, "We should have been much more aggressive in thinking through how the other guy thought." In the nuclear negotiations between the United States and Iran, does each side have an accurate image of the other? Do the Iranians have a realistic assessment of what curtailments in their nuclear program will be necessary to reach a deal in Washington? And vice versa, will the United States agree to a nuclear deal that Iran's negotiating team can sell in Tehran? The embedded proxy status of the nuclear issue in both countries is a key determinant of whether nuclear diplomacy can prove successful. That complex, subtle, and political dynamic is the focus of my new monograph. The United States may assert a general interest in nonproliferation as an international norm, but in practice, it focuses on adversarial proliferators, states that combine capabilities with hostile intent. Hence, with reason, Washington focuses on Iran more than on Israel. The dilemma of the Iranian nuclear challenge is that Iran has mastered uranium enrichment. Centrifuges that spin to produce low-enriched uranium for nuclear power reactors can keep spinning to yield highly enriched uranium for bombs. For this reason, the former head of the International Atomic Energy asserted that any country that had attained this level of technological advancement was a virtual nuclear weapon state. Since nuclear diplomacy with Iran is focused on bounding, not eliminating Iran's uranium enrichment program, the Tehran regime will retain the option, a hedge, for a nuclear weapon. The major stumbling block in the negotiations has been the scale of the uranium enrichment program that Iran would retain under an agreement. The number of centrifuges and their sophistication are key to extending the timeline for a potential breakout. That is, the number of months Iran would need to enrich weapons-grade fissile material if the Tehran regime made the strategic decision to weaponize. The U.S. position is that this breakout period for converting a hedge into a weapon should be long enough, at least 12 months, for the United States to have sufficient strategic warning to mobilize an international response. The current U.S. effort to bound Iran's uranium enrichment program through nuclear diplomacy has a certain historical irony. 4 decades ago, when the Ford administration was cultivating a strategic relationship with the Shah, U.S. officials speculated that the establishment of a multinational facility for producing nuclear fuel in Iran could offer Pakistan, which was then the country of primary proliferation concern to the United States, an alternative to developing its own capability. Indeed, a U.S. national intelligence estimate in 1974 opined that if the Shah was still alive in the 1980s, Iran by then would have become a nuclear weapon state. Whether that prediction would have come to pass is debatable, but the prospect of a nuclear Iran under the Shah would surely not have generated the current sense of urgency and crisis in Washington. The historical juxtaposition between then and now highlights a key proliferation dynamic. A state's nuclear aspirations are not necessarily linked to a specific regime, as they can be shared by regimes of various political stripe over time. However, the perception of threat by the United States is linked to the character of a specific regime, in this case, the Islamic Republic, an adversarial proliferator. Iran's nuclear program is determined and incremental, but it's not the Manhattan Project, a crash program to acquire a weapon in the face of an existential threat. From a national security perspective, a nuclear hedge is Iran's strategic sweet spot, maintaining the potential of a nuclear option while avoiding the regional and international costs of actual weaponization. A hedge strategy that keeps the nuclear option open is not incompatible with a nuclear agreement that would bring the tangible benefits of sanctions relief. A significant but unremarked conclusion of the controversial 2007 National Intelligence Estimate on Iran's nuclear program was the finding that Tehran's decisions are guided by a cost-benefit approach rather than a rush to a weapon, irrespective of the political, economic, and military costs. This analysis countered the occasional depiction of Iran as an undeterrable, essentially irrational rogue state. President Obama has questioned whether, as he put it, the Iranian regime's ideological commitment to nuclear weapons is such that they're not making a simple cost-benefit analysis on this issue. But when asked whether the Iranian regime was messianic or rational, President Obama said that Iranian decision-making over the past 3 decades indicates that the clerics care about the regime's survival. Obama has further argued that the pressure of crippling sanctions grinding the Iranian economy to a halt presents the Tehran regime with the opportunity to make a strategic calculation to defer a decision to weaponize. The paradox of nuclear diplomacy with the Tehran regime is captured in an anonymous quip about the country. Iran does not respond to pressure, but without pressure, Iran does not respond. President Hassan Rouhani, a pragmatic centrist, campaigned on a platform of resolving the nuclear issue to end the country's isolation and the punishing international sanctions that have weakened the country. While acquiescing to Rouhani's revitalized nuclear diplomacy in the wake of his June 2013 electoral mandate, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, remains the final arbiter of any prospective agreement. His decision will hinge on how he manages the unresolved tension in Iran's competing identities, revolutionary state, ordinary country. Diplomatically isolated states, varyingly designated as outlaws, rogues, pariahs, or more recently outliers, have made a strategic calculation to pursue outside engagement when either of two imperatives exists. One, a profound national security challenge, or two, an economic crisis that threatens regime stability. Iran has pragmatically responded to past national security exigencies. The Tehran regime did so in 1985 when it purchased arms from the United States and Israel, the great and lesser Satans, at a low point for Iran in its attritional war with Iraq, and did so again in July 1988 when Khomeini reluctantly drank the cup of poison, as he metaphorically put it, and accepted a UN-brokered truce to end the Iran-Iraq war. Sanctions brought Iran to the negotiating table and will crucially affect the supreme leader's calculus of decision to accept or reject terms for a comprehensive agreement, an agreement that would meaningfully bound Iran's nuclear infrastructure. That strategic calculation will be based on whether the economic benefits of an agreement through sanctions relief outweigh the political costs of disaffecting the core hardline interest groups, especially the Revolutionary Guard, upon which the regime's survival depends. The supreme leader's acceptance of a nuclear accord would be transformative because of the issue's proxy status in Iranian politics. And for that reason, when the crunch point comes next November, Khamenei may balk. A breakdown in diplomacy, however, will not inherently push Iran into a nuclear breakout. Iran has no immediate national security imperative to acquire nuclear weapons. The Tehran regime would retain a hedge, keeping the weapons option open while avoiding the international and regional fallout of overt weaponization. President Obama has declared that the U.S. objective is to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. By drawing this line, red line, preventing weaponization, the president has signaled that the United States would not launch a preventive military action to deny Iran any nuclear hedge option. This distinction between a hedge and a weapon is a major point of contention between the United States and Israel. That Obama's red line on weaponization pushes off a decision on the use of force is a reflection of how unattractive that option would be. That openly debated option on the table, what would be the most telegraphed punch in history by now, runs up against major liabilities. First, it would not end the program, but merely delay it for a few years. As a former IAEA director put it, you can't bomb knowledge. Second, even a so-called limited strike could well escalate into general war. Khamenei has warned that any U.S. military action would lead to Iranian retaliation against U.S. interests worldwide. Third, bombing active nuclear installations, so-called hot sites, carries a significant risk of spewing radioactive toxins into the environment and causing civilian casualties. And fourth, a military strike could well generate a nationalist backlash within Iran with the perverse consequence of bolstering the clerical regime. The challenge of determining whether Iran has crossed the red line of weaponization is compounded by the Tehran regime's hedge strategy, which cultivates ambiguity about its capabilities and intentions. Iran has made progress along the technological continuum toward weaponization, but is unlikely to make a dramatic move, such as conducting a nuclear test or withdrawing from the NPT, that would openly cross the red line of weaponization. Coming to a conclusion now, Hala. Obama's disavowal of containment is a reflection of the meaning the term has taken on in the contemporary debate. That is, acquiescing to Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons and then deterring their use through the retaliatory threat of U.S. nuclear weapons. That connotation is an unfortunate departure from George Kennan's concept of containment, keeping regimes in check until they collapse to their own internal weaknesses. The Obama administration has offered Iran, the outlier, a stark choice: integration or isolation. And therein lies the dilemma. Iran perceives the very process of integration into an international community whose dominant power is the United States as an insidious threat to regime survival. Integration, as through a nuclear deal, offers economic benefits to sustain the regime, but it also carries the risk of political contagion that could destabilize it. That is the crux of Khamenei's dilemma. The surrogate status of the nuclear question in Iran, in turn, presents a dilemma to Washington. The policy spectrum runs from induced integration at one end to coerced regime change at the other. Between them lies that third option of containment. Integration has been called America's grand strategy. Containment has been the default alternative when integration is not possible. With Iran, an updated version of Kennan's strategy would decouple the nuclear issue from the question of regime change and rely on internal forces as the agent of societal change. This is the best of a bad set of options and will require a robust strategy of containment in form, if not in name. To extend the chess metaphor, the United States must be prepared for a long game with this nuclear outlier. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Mitchell Reese.
Sure.
Yeah,
Should we
you
just
can stay
sit here?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Thank you, Hala, and thank you, Rob, for an excellent paper. It's always a real pleasure to be back at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where I spent 4 wonderful years. The key question, which Rob rightly identifies both in his excellent monograph and in his comments, is whether Iran wants to remain a revolutionary state committed to revising the Middle East, or whether it wants to become a more ordinary country that can assume its place within the existing regional order. 35 years after the Iranian Revolution, we still do not have an answer to that question. But let's suppose for a moment that the two sides are able to reach an agreement on the nuclear deal, which I think is an unlikely outcome even with a 4-month extension. Does anyone think that this agreement would resolve this fundamental question, or merely postpone it? This dilemma goes to the heart of the skepticism that many people have about these negotiations. The regime's intentions seem malign, even if there were to be a nuclear agreement. Now, one reason for this skepticism is that it has been very difficult to separate the nuclear issue from the other issues on our agenda with Iran. Some of these are related issues, like ballistic missiles, and others are tangential, like the status of human rights inside Iran and Tehran's support for terrorism. Now, the White House has not helped its case here. The administration has done a poor job of controlling the narrative of these negotiations, allowing these other issues to diminish the focus on nuclear matters and complicate the debate. There appears to be no congressional strategy or larger communication strategy, thereby allowing all 535 secretaries of state on the Hill to each provide his or her own opinion on the details of a nuclear agreement. Now, it may be that the administration is taking a page from the Clinton administration's playbook back in 1994 with the agreed framework nuclear deal with North Korea, where the Clinton administration essentially presented Congress with a fait accompli. The Republicans, who had just won the majority drafting behind Newt Gingrich's contract with America, had only 2 choices: to either accept the agreed framework or to defeat the agreed framework and then take responsibility for the consequences, which would have included an escalation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula, perhaps leading to conflict. The Republicans grumbled, but basically supported the North Korean deal. The 4-month extension now in play will allow the talks to get past the November midterm elections. David and others have speculated that this time period was by White House design, so that should they reach an agreement, they could then use this lame duck period, even if the Republicans win control of the Senate in November, to get the necessary votes to lift sanctions and endorse whatever other elements of the agreement need Senate approval. Now, I think that this approach, should it come to pass, may be more difficult for the White House than it may realize. Should the Republicans win in November, the president would then be asking defeated Democratic senators to support him, when many of them might feel that he was a reason for their defeat. We also know that this issue does not fall neatly along partisan political lines, and that many Democrats are as highly critical of Iran and as suspicious of a nuclear agreement as their Republican colleagues. Another reason that so many people are suspicious is because we have such poor intel on Iran and its intentions. As Rob states in his paper and his remarks, the U.S. does not have good intelligence on the inner workings of the Iranian government, especially the nuclear decision-making. The administration's publicly stated position is to ensure that the breakout period for Iran is at least 1 year, so that the U.S. and others can have sufficient time to take countermeasures. Yet the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate took 4 years to confirm that Iran had suspended the military components of its covert nuclear program, overturning a 2003 assessment. As Rob writes, quote, "This finding essentially reversed that of the previous NIE," unquote. How can we have confidence that the intelligence community can identify this type of Iranian activity within a relatively short period of time, 12 to 18 months maximum, given this track record, given our ongoing difficulty peering inside Iran, and not least, given the enormously high stakes involved? Finally, here's what I think is the most likely scenario. The Republicans will win the Senate in November, and there will be no agreement by the expiration of the extension date. What happens then? What are the options? Well, one might be that the White House may try for another extension. A second option is that President Obama could replay his non-decision decision from August 2013 on the chemical weapons in Syria and throw the issue to Congress over whether to use military force or not against the Iranians. Third is that Congress could ratchet up sanctions. And fourth is that Israel could lose patience and unilaterally strike against Iran. How would I handicap the odds for each of these? On the extension of the negotiations, again, I think the odds are pretty even money. I think that the White House would be tempted to continue to kick this can down the road for as long as it can. In terms of the president offering the option to go to war with Iran to Congress, as he did in August of 2013 over Syria, I think that that's unlikely, in part because the president couldn't be sure how the Senate might decide on that. Third, Congress could ratchet up sanctions. I think that's very likely, almost absolutely certain to take place. And the last option, Israel. Israel could lose patience and unilaterally strike against Iran. I think that that's unlikely for the time being. The administration has been very careful to stay close to Israel, and a major objective for the remainder of the president's second term in office would be for it to ensure that Israel does not unilaterally attack Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David.
Well, thank you, Halle. Thank you, Rob, for this incredibly good piece of work here, and it's wonderful to be back at the Wilson Center. I was here a number of years ago when I was writing The Inheritance, and it was Rob and Lee Hamilton and others who came up with the helped me come up with the title for the sections that dealt with Iran, which was the Mullah's Manhattan Project. And while it is perhaps a Manhattan Project, it is, as Rob laid out, one that's taken place in extraordinarily slow motion. And I think the conclusion I came to in The Inheritance is very similar to the one that Rob came to here, which is that what the Iranians want, of course, is the capability, not the weapon. The weapon itself brings about a world of hurt to them, and they don't need it for the ultimate objective here, which is to make them the greatest power in the region. All they need for that is the knowledge that everyone has that they could race for a weapon if they came to the conclusion that they needed one. So a few observations about the Vienna talks, because I agree with almost everything, with a few small exceptions I'll mention here that we've heard so far. First of all, the major impediment to an agreement is that these talks are being held in an incredibly pleasant place. So the incentives for both sides to leave the lovely coffee houses and all of that, and if you really want to get this done, we need a competition of sort of the most miserable places on earth in which to conduct the negotiation.
Pyongyang gets my vote.
Camp David.
Maybe Washington in August. I mean, right. But I think that as you watch these negotiations play out, all of the players recognize that there are two things going on here simultaneously, one of which is very easy to explain and one of which is very difficult to explain. The easier one to explain is the obvious element that if the United States and Iran can work out an agreement on this after 30 years of not talking with each other, it could be the beginning of an alignment of many other interests and a realignment of American interests in the Middle East. And it might step toward resolving the tension that Rob noted in the monograph and that Mitchell discussed, which is whether Iran wants to be a revolution or a state, or an ordinary state. My guess is that right now the Iranian leadership believes that it can reach this agreement without having to resolve that issue.
That's right.
And one of the oddities of watching the negotiation take place is that while we all know that the overarching question is this question of the U.S.-Iranian relationship and the future of the Iranian state, the negotiation itself is of such mind-boggling complexity that the people who are negotiating it on all sides all sort of come out of these sessions holding their head and saying, we're interested in rethinking Iran's role in the world, and we have just spent 8 hours discussing how do you affect plutonium output out of the back of the Iraq reactor. And so you have a discussion that's taking place at one level, the political level, among this leadership there. And while I was there, it was a quite remarkable scene. You had the number 1, 2, and 3 officials of the State Department there, Secretary of State Kerry, Undersecretary Bill Burns, and Wendy Sherman. And then you had a huge backup team of State Department experts, Defense Department experts, CIA and other intelligence officials who were there trying to pretend that they weren't there. And you had the same thing going on the Iranian side. The brother of President Rouhani showed up at the negotiations one day. And then this was the day that Secretary Kerry was most involved, and then he disappeared to go back. So they're all going back to sort of check with Central Command to see just how far they can go. I share, I'm afraid to say, the skepticism that we've heard from Mitchell that this is workable in the next 4 months. But I think the Iranians have calculated that President Obama is so invested at this point in this negotiation that he is unlikely at the end of 4 months, even if there is no agreement, to walk away from it, precisely because the options out there that Mitchell laid out at the end of his talk are all so unappealing. So if you think about that list, an extension again, I give that a very high chance, in part because the original agreement calls for 6 months, so they'd have at least 2 more months that would be acceptable under the original agreement. And in part because it's not really in either side's interest at this point to go see a breakdown. The president offering Congress the choice whether to take military action or not, something tells me he's not likely to try that a second time. The question of ratcheting up sanctions, Congress could do it. The president's got the power to veto it. It would require actual legislation. And could Israel lose patience? It certainly could, but I think the argument can be made to the Israelis that since Iran has blended down the 20% fuel that they were most worried about, that took them closest to a weapon, they're actually in better shape right now than they were a year ago. And I think that's demonstrably true, and it was interesting that you did not hear Israel complain at all when the extension got announced last week. And so I think the Israelis know that. They also have some other issues on their plate right now. Let's think a little bit more about President Obama's calculus going forward here. He would like this very much because the president needs a significant foreign policy win at a time that obviously the hopes for a Middle East settlement of the kind that Secretary Kerry worked for seem more distant now than they have at other times. Iraq and Afghanistan are not looking so terrific. So I think the Iranians look at President Obama and they say he needs this more than we do. And I think the administration looks at the supreme leader and they say he needs this more than we do. That clearly the people of Iran, and this is really much more the territory of Ale and Robin Wright and other friends in the audience here, I think that the Iranian populace probably isn't terribly interested in the details of what the agreement is. They want a way to get the sanctions lifted so that they can have normal financial interactions, normal visas, come to American universities, and so forth. Just as long as the agreement can be spun by all sides as a victory, that they didn't back down in the face of American pressure. And what struck me in covering the negotiations was how hard the Americans and the Europeans were working to come up with relatively face-saving propositions that would both lengthen the potential for breakout time and reduce the Iranian need to claim that the United States had won something big. So I think one of the challenges going forward, for example, is how do you keep roughly the same size of the nuclear infrastructure in total as you have now, but disconnect enough parts of it that you're extending the breakout time so that no one has to say that they have decommissioned very much. That's essentially what you're seeing happen in the discussion about Iraq, where they're taking the facility and trying to figure out how to slow its output of plutonium. It's essentially what they're doing in the discussion of Fordo, the deep underground site, where the conversation is not about destroying Fordo, but converting it to an R&D lab, converting it to a space radiation research center. That was an idea that that Minister Salehi put out about a year ago. There have been other suggestions I've heard that were sort of around in the in the bars in Vienna, which would be turn it into Disney's next Space Mountain. That might work. The world's greatest underground bowling alley. I think the United States would take, and the European allies would take any of these just to extend breakout time and enable the Iranians to say that Fordo lives in some way. The hardest thing to do is to make this work with the number of centrifuges for uranium enrichment. Because while centrifuges spin, you can't spin the number of centrifuges. In the end, there will either be fewer there than there are today, or there won't be. Now, there are a couple of technical ideas that are kicking around. I won't bore you all with them today about what you might do to extend the breakout times, even with the numbers there. But what I thought was interesting a week ago today, when I went in for an interview with Foreign Minister Zarif, in which he made the proposal that Iran essentially continue the program it has now for 3, 4, 5, maybe as far as 7 years, and then be freed up to do industrial production later, is that it seemed clear to me that he could negotiate on almost any detail except taking away the number of existing centrifuges. Everything else is negotiable. How long, perhaps what the output is for that period of time, and so forth. The United States had a very difficult time in accepting that and has, in fact, outright rejected it because the administration, including Secretary Kerry, are on record saying the current number of centrifuges producing at the current levels are unacceptable. They give you a breakout time of months, not years. And over time, to make this truly mind-numbing for all of you who are following each and every one, watch for the discussion to shift away from the number of centrifuges, which has been what we've all been preoccupied with because it's a set of digits you can have, to, God help us all, the amount of SWU coming through it. This is separated work units, but basically the amount of uranium, enriched uranium, that is produced out of this. Because that gives you the opportunity to play with the numbers and kind of centrifuges that you have. If you had more sophisticated centrifuges going in, you could have fewer of them and still maintain similar output. So, as you can see, when I said that this was of mind-numbing complexity, I wasn't exaggerating. But there are some creative solutions that are being kicked around there. And I think in the end, it's because you have seen Minister Zarif and his team and the Americans come up with a couple of innovative ideas that the president decided that it was worth the shot of the 4 more months. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rob, do you want to?
No, you go ahead and with your questions.
To what they were saying. You mentioned that, David, that the Iranians really, your sense is that they want a deal. And I agree with you that for the people, it's not the details. For the Iranian people, details are not important. But every time one senses that there is going to be an agreement or a consensus among the Iranians, the supreme leader steps in and talks about these issues. You mentioned SWU, everybody was surprised that he brought it up in his speech.
I don't think I've ever heard an American president discuss SWU in public. Yeah, I agree.
And so, my question to all three of you is that you have the Iranians who wanted it, you have the Americans who wanted it, you have the Europeans who can't wait to have a deal for whatever reason, and the Russian and the Chinese equally. So what does it take, really, to have a deal within the next 4 months? Because, again, my sense is that if within the next 4 months we don't have a deal, the supreme leader would lose his patience with Zarif, with Rouhani, with the whole team. So what does it really take? What is realistic for the United States and for Iran to have a deal without losing face?
Well, I'll take a first shot and see what our other panelists say. One of the oddities of these negotiations is every time the Supreme Leader has spoken on this, it has seemed as if he has restricted in some way the flexibility that President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif might have in the negotiations. And I don't have the advantage that many of you have of reading what he said in his native tongue. But as it was transcribed out to me, it struck me as one of those speeches, sort of like if you think about the Khrushchev letters during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you had to pick out which part of it you wanted to pay attention to and which part of it you wanted to ignore. Okay? So if you wanted to say this is useless, forget it, you would read the part about having 190,000 SWU, which would be basically almost 190,000 or a little more than 190,000 of the existing low technology centrifuges in place. If you wanted to just do what Kennedy did and respond to the part of the letter that you liked, then you would deal with what he said about time period, where he said, we don't need this in 5 or 7 years. We need this basically to make our own fuel. And Minister Zarif emphasized to me several times in the course of our conversation that their fundamental problem is they don't trust anybody would keep the supply of fuel going to them, even the Russians who are supplying the fuel for Bushehr. So when I said before that this is a moment for some creative solutions, one of them Bob Einhorn has come up with in recent times, which is pre-sell to the Iranians 5 or 10 or 15 or 25 years of fuel in fuel rods and let them keep it on their territory so that you can take away this argument that somebody would cut them off at some point in the future.
I would. It's not a technical issue. That's sort of the thesis of the paper. You could resolve it, in those terms pretty readily, but it's this embedded proxy status. And as David said, the intent seems to be to try to reach an agreement without resolving this tension about this broader debate in the country. The Supreme Leader, at one point said that Iran would exercise heroic flexibility in the negotiations. Well, the United States has shown considerable flexibility. I mean, the initial American position was zero centrifuges, given the record, and we've moved considerably towards the Iranian position. Given that there's that the putative energy rationale for the program, really doesn't stand up. I mean, they vent more natural gas than this nuclear program would produce. They've made an oversized investment in enrichment with reactors that aren't even on the drawing board, that their capability wouldn't allow them to take over from the Russians for Bushehr. In any case, for technical reasons, that have been addressed. This is a good deal for Iran. I mean, it would allow them to maintain a program, to retain the hedge, and would offer the prospect of sanctions relief. So I think this is a good deal for them. I don't know, calculations who needs it more. I think President Obama, I take him at his word that he would walk away from a bad deal. At which point, Gary Seymour to David, has talked about ramping up economic sanctions that would, more or less be like an economic blockade of Iran. And I know there's skepticism. I see Patrick Clausen there who's written about economic sanctions and the difficulty of maintaining them, and that they would erode over time. But I think that would be the response to no agreement by November.
Well, we have a precedent for when a supreme leader has reversed himself, and that was Ayatollah Khamenei during the Iran-Iraq War. And the precedent was, unremitting, unrelenting setbacks for the Iranian regime. And so can you imagine that something similar like that would happen to fundamentally erode the position of the Iranians over the next 4 months? And it's fanciful, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to imagine that their position would change so fundamentally that they would want to seek out any deal just to stop the pain so that they could recalibrate and reset themselves. That's unlikely. So I remain skeptical of there being a deal. And as David is saying, what he's presenting is what negotiators love to do, which is to come up with creative technical solutions to what is essentially a political problem. And we also play around with time periods, and that's another way to try to evade or elide around the political problem. But the political problem, as Rob highlights in the paper correctly, is what type of relationship does Iran want to have with its neighbors and with the United States? I thought I heard David say that he thinks even a nuclear agreement would not present Iran with that stark choice. And I think that that's absolutely correct, in part because Iran doesn't want to have to choose.
That's right.
And it doesn't have to choose by the nature of this agreement. Another reason why it won't present them with a stark enough choice is because I don't think Congress would allow it. In terms of blanket relief of all the sanctions that are in place that would really open up the outside world to the Iranians in a way that would fundamentally threaten the regime's control over its people.
Just one comment on that. I think Mitchell stated very well that the agreement would allow Iran to retain a hedge, and the Obama administration, pushing back against congressional pressure, has really segregated the agreement. They haven't sort of made it reliant on kind of clearing up the issues related to it as being a state sponsor of terrorism or human rights, et cetera. Part of the pressure that Obama would have to rebuff is congressional efforts to kind of do the full Monty, to say we need to include, and it was in the Menendez legislation, we have to talk about human rights and state sponsorship of terrorism. So in a sense, the Obama administration, they'd have to work the politics on this side, but they've offered them a deal that meets Iran's national security requirements, and really, by remaining kind of segregated to the nuclear issue, doesn't force them. In a way, that's political cover for them having to make this broader question about the relationship with the outside world. They can say, hey, it's just a nuclear deal. It doesn't mean anything more than that.
I think you're absolutely right. And Mitchell makes the good point that the negotiators are sitting there trying to come up with technical solutions to essentially a political problem. But those technical solutions are designed to lay bare whether or not Iran really wants to solve what it says are its motivations for producing fuel, which is to fuel Bushehr, which already has fuel from Russia that has to be licensed by Russia if Russia is going to allow anybody else to go do that. And the recent behavior of Vladimir Putin would suggest that might not happen.
But it won't do that because take Bob Einhorn's deal.
That's right.
Okay, you don't need any uranium enrichment.
That's right.
So they should have zero.
And they don't have any other reactors that are under construction right now. So I think what the United States is trying to do is basically come up with a series of proposals that undercut the overall rationale that they need uranium for some peaceful purpose. I'm not sure that they're going to be able to get there, because that would essentially mean that the U.S. and the European allies would allow Iran only a face-saving, token, very small enrichment program, so that the Supreme Leader could give a speech saying we retain our enrichment program, our R&D, and our integrity. And in the end, I think when they look at what the sticker shock of the actual deal is going to be, I think it's going to be very hard, not only for the clerical leadership, but for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to make that choice.
The Supreme Leader has time and again made it clear that the nuclear negotiations have nothing to do with establishing diplomatic relations with the United States, nor did the group that went to negotiate in Geneva and Vienna had the mandate to talk publicly in sessions on human rights issues and other issues. Probably privately on one-on-one, they could have done it, but they don't have, and their mandate is restricted. Now, my question to all three of you is that, does the United States and the European, do they understand how much pressure the Iranian delegation is under, and this is the best they can get when it comes to negotiating the nuclear issue, if they don't succeed? Because this is the best that Iran could produce, the team, which is very knowledgeable and has this mandate. If there is no deal.
Well, I don't know what the U.S. government thinks, and there is no such thing really as a U.S. government. There's just various departments. There's no such thing as a State Department. There's individuals in the State Department. So without being pedantic about it, it really depends on who the decision-making leadership is on this particular issue. But Hala, I have to say, you don't know what the bottom line is for Iran until you walk away from the table. And we don't know that this is the best deal that the Iranians can offer us. We certainly think that we can get a better deal, or else we wouldn't have extended the negotiations for 4 more months. So I'm not sure. That's the narrative that is out there. I think that our negotiators are tough-minded enough to keep on pushing. We'll see if they can get a better deal. We'll see if they can get any deal at all. But I sort of recoil at the thought that we have to take what's on the table because this is as good as it gets, and it's going to be our fault if we walk away.
If the talks break down, there should be the United States and the P5+1 should make the negotiating record public to make it clear what was the offer on the table. I think one of the issues that's been raised is whether the Iranian negotiating team has really prepared the hardliners there for what it would take to get a deal. And here there's been some, issue about kind of the Rouhani team versus those around the Supreme Leader. But the Supreme Leader is the arbiter, the final arbiter, and we can't. The criterion of a deal is not what is possible for this negotiating team to come up with that they think they can sell back in Tehran. In 2009, we reached that kind of a deal, and then this was under Ahmadinejad, and when it went back to Tehran, the Supreme Leader balked.
What strikes me about just watching the negotiations is they're underway in the most professional way. You never see, even amid disagreements, people standing up and grandstanding in front of the cameras, or even background conversations saying, the United States, the Europeans are trying to crush us, or you don't hear the Americans, declaring that the Iranians are more interested in being in a revolutionary regime than, Foreign Minister Zarif is obviously, having spent, 30 years in the United States, he knows the U.S. extremely well. He makes the arguments in very westernized and Americanized terms and all that. So I think if there is a deal to be had, this is probably the best negotiating team that the U.S. is going to face from Iran to get one.
Thank you. We're opening the floor to your question. Patrick, can you wait for the... Yes.
Patrick Lawson from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. The panelists discussed in some detail what Iran would give up in a nuclear deal, but we heard much less about what the United States might do in a nuclear deal. And in particular, in light of what seems to be a relatively modest actions which Iran is going to be asked to take, what do you think are the prospects the U.S. will do much more than relatively modest sanctions relief?
This is a complicated question. Robin writes here. They had a whole session at the U.S. Institute of Peace on the sanctions. The president, I guess, would begin with what he could do by executive order, and that would cover, it's an estimated 40% of the sanctions, and the remaining 60% would require, congressional legislation. There's bound to be a dispute between the Congress and the president over the waivers that he issues for to bring sanctions relief to Iran. The sanctions are overlapping. I mean, we do nuclear, the nuclear ones, the terrorism ones, the human rights ones, and disentangling them to do kind of nuclear alone. Just that aspect of it may not bring, much relief, tangible relief to the Iranians. And there will be pushback in the Congress to doing so, because going back to this sort of optic I've used in the paper is that really is about the regime, and that includes not just the nuclear piece, but it's state sponsorship of terrorism and human rights. And I think that there's going to be resistance to kind of sanctions relief on nuclear alone grounds if these other areas of conduct are out there. But that's a political matter that the Obama administration will have to push. But the EU can do more on the banking side to basically kind of end Iran's pariah status as in the international in terms of international financial transactions, but maintaining, managing that's going to be a delicate process on the American side. It'll be even tougher, or it'll be tough if diplomacy fails and they ratchet up sanctions to kind of approaching that of essentially an economic blockade of Iran.
Yes, let's go from this side to the middle, and yes.
Thank you. I'm Chris Bidwell from the Federation of American Science. scientists. Excuse me. My question is, we talked a little bit about the pre-deal, and we talked about a deal, but I'd like the panel to talk a little bit about the post-deal. And what I mean by that is, how are we going to know that Iran's keeping its end of the deal? How is Iran going to get sanctions relief from businesses who may make a choice not to still not to do business with Iran? How do you see so the verification aspect of this and the post-deal sanctions relief from the business perspective? Can one of you take that on, please? Thank you.
David,
Sure, it's a very good question. So, on the business side of it, businesses, I think, would have to believe that whatever sanctions relief there isn't going to get reimposed a few years out. I mean, if you're making decisions to go invest in, say, the Iranian oil industry, you don't want to discover $2 billion into your capital investment that suddenly the deal has gone bad and you're suddenly out again, or your effort gets nationalized. So I think it's going to be very difficult. And if you look at the early evidence, even after sanctions were lifted, the modest group of sanctions that were lifted for the preliminary deal, you may remember that we heard a lot from our Israeli friends saying that this would break all the sanctions and that everybody would try to rush in once the small number was lifted. Well, that's not what happened. And in fact, several Israeli officials have said to me with surprise that they were wrong, that in fact most companies, most financial institutions were quite reluctant to go in part because the rules under which of what they were allowed to do and were so complex that they decided really to err on the side of caution. The second part of your question goes to verification. And there are sort of three elements to this. One is verification of what's going on the ground right now. And I was at the IAEA some while we were in Vienna, and they're pretty pleased with the access they have been given for current activity. And I think it's fair to say that the Iranians have pretty well lived up to everything that they said they would allow to have inspected and so forth. Then there's the much harder question of what is delicately called the possible military dimensions, which is what design work was done on a weapon. And there are 12 outstanding issues, of which Iran has resolved one half of the first issue. Okay? And so the schedule for getting through this 12, if things stay at the current pace, would be extremely long. And the Iranians have to make a very difficult decision, which is how much do they want to reveal the activities of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh and others who were critical to the program and probably still are. And then there's a question of how much you get into the laboratories, military facilities. The additional protocol alone, which is the agreement under the IAEA's rules that would allow greater transparency. Almost everybody on the Western side of the negotiations tells me that just implementing that protocol will not be enough to give them the kind of assurances they want. So they need that plus.
Mm-hmm. And one more thing we really haven't talked about is the duration of the agreement under which they would be subject to enhanced scrutiny. And there's been a number of papers published in Washington in the last few months saying that it should be of unlimited duration. Others have pushed back, saying it should be 20 years. I think the Iranians have said 3 to 7 years is what they'll abide by.
The 7 years comes from the moment when they need to go get the next batch of fuel for Bushehr.
So it's not just the compliance mechanism itself and that whole infrastructure, which is enormously complicated, as David mentioned, but it's also how long it stays in place. And each of these, I think, are going to be subject to intense debate.
During the implementation phase, if there is an agreement, I think the biggest danger would be of an undeclared site where, like Fordo, or Natanz, where they're doing an additional kind of covert enrichment, and there would need to be a mechanism in place through the additional protocol to provide for challenge inspections to visit sites. But in the paper, as I do comparative proliferation policy, I look at the North Korean case, and in 2002, the North Koreans were caught cheating on the nuclear agreement that Mitchell was involved in.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding everybody.
Over actually it was the flip of the Iranian program. They had a plutonium-based program that was frozen by the '94 agreement, and then they had a covert HEU program that they were confronted on, and that was taken as occasion by the Bush administration to kind of abrogate the agreement and say it's off, and all these nuclear fuel rods that had been in cooling ponds were taken out of the ponds. They separated the plutonium, and that's where this current arsenal of 6, 7, 8 weapons came from. It was from the plutonium program. So to confront the North Koreans on a plutonium program of unknown scope and unknown urgency, the administration jettisoned an agreement that had a plutonium program of known scope and known urgency bottled up. So when we get to an implementation, if there is one, when the charges occurred, and the State Department official, I think, said that the Iranians are bound to cheat on agreements. There was a more colorful phrase I think you used in Hill testimony. We have to think through what will happen when there is something like that comes along, and not jettisoning the entire agreement, but using the Joint Commission within it to sort of address violations of the accord.
So I'm really trying hard here not to be too defensive, but the 2002 incident that Rob described, exactly correct. It actually has a history to it, which is that as early as the late 1990s, the intelligence community thought they knew, degrees of knowing, that the North Koreans were building a centrifuge facility. And so there were annual certifications that they had to make to Congress. I think starting in 1998, they couldn't make them. And that's actually what kicked off the Perry report, and that whole thing is a way to try to walk that back and see if you could try to figure that out so it didn't disrupt the agreed framework. The takeaway isn't to debate the merits of the agreed framework. It's really to suggest there's an enormous burden on the intelligence community, and there are pressures for them to be absolutely positive, and to the extent that whether it's a 12 to 18-month breakout period or not, there's just going to be a great deal of difficulty in having the type of certainty that we would all like to have, that a president would love to have, and that you never, ever have as a policymaker.
Let's just leap in on the never, ever have here. I mean, what we're all remembering, and what I get constant emails and letters about whenever I write about Iran, are readers who say, well, remember Iraq, where were the nuclear weapons, and so forth and so on. And Iraq was a case, obviously, where the intelligence was completely wrong. But prior to that, we'd had many other cases in which the intelligence tended to underestimate how far nuclear programs went. So, Harry Truman had a memo on his desk saying that the Soviets were, I think, a year away.
Always 5 years away.
Always 5 years, right. It was at least a year away from having a nuclear weapon, and it went off the weekend he got the test, the weekend that he got the memo. They were wrong on how the progress that China had made, on India and Pakistan, on the joint India-Pakistan test, on how much progress Saddam Hussein had made before the first Persian Gulf War. So we actually have a perfect record when it comes to estimating these things, and I think that's worth remembering as you think about how you'd verify this.
And that's one reason why there's enormous skepticism about putting so much of a burden on this 12 to 18-month period.
Yeah. But also consider, look at the Syrian case. You had actual chemical weapons use. And look at how much kind of questions were kicked up by the Russians and others about who did it. Was it the government? Was it the opposition? Just imagine, we've set the red line of weaponization. What would be that red line? I said in the book, it would have to be a test like Iran, North Korea did in 2006. Something demonstrable like that, or withdraw from the NPT. The president can't get up and say, they've gone from 20% to 70%, we're going to war. The United States does not go to war over a percentage. It's not going to happen. It's
That's not weaponization anyway.
Yeah, it's not. But creating the potential for it. But it's hard to kind of hold these lines.
So, I'm afraid we have run out of time, and I would like to thank the panelists, and it's nice to end up at this upbeat note.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks a lot.